All right, I think we're live and recording. The tech team says we're live and recording. Hello and welcome to the Phoenix Business Forum. My name is Presley Reeder, and I want to welcome those of you joining us live via Facebook and those of you here in our live studio audience. We do have a live studio audience joining me somewhere behind the screen, and glad to have all of you with us. Our goal here at the forum is to give you transformative content by interviewing local Phoenix influencers who are awesome. And hopefully you have gotten a chance to tune into one of our live events in the past. They're every Wednesday, first Wednesday of the month that we do those interviews. And I have certainly been privileged to sit down with all of those guests, and they have been awesome. So if you haven't had a chance to tune into one of the live events, please go to our webpage, phoenixbusinessforum.com, or one of the social media sites and take a look at one of our past interviews. Today's interview is going to be no different. We have an awesome Phoenix influencer with us, Dr. Michael Berens, and we're going to talk with Mike here in a minute. In fact, we'll have a conversation that lasts about 45 minutes. And then we will turn off the live stream and have an in-person Q&A with our live studio audience. And on that note, if you're interested in being a part of the live studio audience, you can contact us at one of the sites I mentioned and get an invitation to participate. We'd love to have you come in person and be a part of our live event. As I said, today our guest is Dr. Michael Berens, and I am certainly privileged to speak with him. Mike is probably the smartest and kindest person that you will meet in 2021 if you have the privilege of meeting him. And I hope you do, because it will be a wonderful experience. And I know today's interview is going to be a wonderful experience as well. One more thing before we start the interview, I want to thank Living Streams Church. That's who hosts this event. That's where I'm located. And then also want to thank Mel Schultz. Mel has been the sponsor of this event for over a decade, and we're grateful for that sponsorship. And Mel will be joining us as our guest on the first Wednesday in February. So make sure you put that on your calendar, grab a lunch, join us live for that interview with Mel Schultz. Okay, let's talk to Dr. Michael Berens now. Mike, as I said, is awesome. Let me tell you a few of the things about him that make him so awesome. First of all, he's been in Phoenix since 1953, and I honestly don't know how old he is. So we're going to ask him what brought him here. It may have been birth, but that's almost 70 years. And he's an ASU grad, so he's just entrenched in the Valley of the Sun. He's also the director of the Cancer and Cell Biology Division at TGen. And if you don't know what TGen is, Mike's going to tell us what TGen is and what he does there. He has other roles that he's going to explain to us. To be honest, when you read the bio of somebody who's a PhD and is the director of the Cancer and Cell Division at TGen, there are a lot of words in there that you can't even spell, let alone understand. So I'm going to count on Mike to walk us through that in our conversation today. Again, we're going to talk with Mike for about 40 minutes, and I think that's enough to let Mike start talking. Mike, I actually want to start with this Valley of the Sun history, if you don't mind, before we get into TGen and your role there. But you've been here since 1953. You went to ASU. I know you left at one point, but what is it that you love so much about the Valley of the Sun that keeps you coming back for more?
Oh boy, what a great place to grow up, Presley. This is fantastic. I was actually very short when we moved here. I think I was 4 months old when my dad, who was finishing a surgical fellowship at what is called the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, made the decision that, I've been in Minnesota for 4 years and 12 winters, that time to go warm up. And so my dad relocated the family. I'm baby number 3 from Minnesota. I have 2 other siblings that joined our crew once we relocated to Arizona. So I'm one of 5 siblings. And that actually is a huge anchor for me to stay connected. All 5 siblings are still here in the greater Phoenix area. Just full of joy with all the nieces and nephews and the in-laws and outlaws that make up extended family. Both my parents have passed away, so I'm wearing the title of orphan, which is we all get to do at some point, which is interesting. But Phoenix has been a great place to grow up. I love it. It's a make it happen kind of environment. It's very tolerant, if you will, to risk taking. And that has a lot to do with, I think, respecting this human tendency to say, I wonder if I can do this. And there are very, very few external caps or limitations on that. So growing up in Phoenix, I had wonderful opportunities, have built lifelong friendships. I have classmates from the first grade that I'm still in contact with. It just amazes me.
That's
So
fantastic.
pretty exciting.
Yeah, I love what you said there about the human tendency to ask if you can do this. I mean, that really fits in with what we're trying to do here at the forum, is talk to people about that human tendency. And it's a great transition into your decision to join TGen. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of TGen, and then roll into your decision to be a part of that? It's a kind of the question, what's a human capable of doing, right?
Oh yeah. It's important to distill things down to essence in a certain point. Not that it's a reductionist approach to life, but we realize the human spirit is one of adventure and discovery and development of full potential. And it's also why humans typically react compassionately about human disease, is that, well, wait, I'm not limited by that. Why is this? So we have this personal, even if it's unspoken, this aspiration to push my own limits. And then when we see others that are caught in the snares of human disease, some of it human developed, right? Conflict and inappropriate behaviors that restrict human development. We react viscerally to, like, that shouldn't be. And so both on the disease side and then the human exploitation side, we react to that because we're wired in a way to say, let's flourish. And so it's a great environment. The founding of TGen took place in 2002. If I can just address that one head on, Presley. Here's a fun story that I like to share. The founding president and scientific director of TGen is a spectacular scientist, Dr. Jeff Trent, who was at the Human Genome Institute with Dr. Francis Collins, and that's a name that a lot of people know, wrote a book called DNA, The Language of God. Jeff Trent and I were friends in graduate school back in the late 70s. One of my favorite stories is the first time that Jeff and I were in prison together was in the late 70s. We were on a church softball team and went to play a softball game against the prisoners in Florence. And so we have been in prison together, which is kind of a funny thing to say.
That is a good story. Can you beat the prisoners, or you feel comfortable?
Not even close.
Oh, no, they just whipped you, huh?
Oh, okay. We got slaughtered. I think they spend more time on their game than we did.
It's possible.
Yeah.
That's a good story, though. Okay. So you and Jeff go way back.
We go way back. And I think one of the things that I'd want to tell people, for as entrepreneurial as Arizona is, that there's a key element in doing new things. And that is, if you get to do something really new in alliance with a long-term relationship where you have very high trust, and it takes very few words to communicate connectivity and assess alignment, that's a really important, valuable aspect of doing something new that has a high likelihood of moving forward. And so it's interesting, as young as TGen was, right? At some point it was not here, and then it was here. There's some very well-established long-term high trust relationships that undergird this creative venture to say, can we take the human genome and not only look at it as a research tool to understand disease, but can we make it a medical tool where we could use the genomic DNA sequencing information to guide care for patients with disease, to foster an environment where they can reach their full potential, where they can flourish. And that's the driving impetus. I guess the other modifier I'd say about it is we want to do that now. We have an incredibly boiling appetite to say, how much can we do today for patients in need?
Yeah, you made a distinction there that I want to make sure I understand and our listeners understand. The human genome was being treated one way, and then TGen wanted to treat it a different way. And what I heard you say was that the first way it was being treated was strictly for research purposes, maybe, or not necessarily to directly benefit the health or address disease. And TGen wanted to really focus in on how to use it to address that. Am I saying that right?
You've hit the nail exactly on the head.
Okay.
Probably the main driver for not using genomics as a clinical tool is it's just way too slow and way too expensive. So sequencing the first human genome took $3 billion and took 10 years. Today, at TGen, and we're not alone on the planet in that regard, but the technology lets us sequence a human genome overnight for around $1,000. So this transition in the last 20 years of cost reduction and speed of data production, and you have to have the supercomputers that can analyze the data, but allows us to ask questions that, frankly, 20 years ago when we started TGen, someday we might be able to ask it. Well, we're asking those questions today. So it's been transformative to be part of the catalyst to move faster at lower cost with industry, which has been good for business all over the world, to help put this incredible science to work on behalf of patients suffering with disease.
So if I could try to then bring that even a level further down into an individual who has a disease or a family struggling with a disease, I hear you say that technology has improved. TGen has been a catalyst in helping that research move forward, which is great, exciting. What difference does that make to me?
I think where the science of DNA sequencing or genomics touches us as individuals is when we come of age as adults and we're now agents of our own trajectory. I have aspirations. I want to be a parent, or I want to be involved in making a difference in my community. We see those around us that have external constraints or even internal constraints put on them by disease. And so we all end up at a point where saying, oh yeah, I had an uncle or I had an aunt or a cousin who came down with a form of cancer or had a debilitating neuromuscular disease that was just tragic, or an autoimmune disease. So we're aware that there are these things that happen. Understanding the genetic code in individuals with disease compared to those without it gives us insight into what kinds of things are happening. And as we can narrow down, we call them driver events. What are the real events that drive the malady, drive the disease? Can we then come up with ways to get in the way of that? Or can we slow it down? Or can we avoid the development of disease? Those are powerfully personal interests by everyone, and they're of huge significance to us in a community. So we could drop the incidence of cancer in the state of Arizona by 10%. The economic return on that would be massive because people are constrained and they're not able to reach their full potential. So diseases are a burden for individuals and for a community. And I think we're in this together to say, how do we understand the disease better? How do we avoid it? Can we prevent it? And then if someone's on that track, how can we abbreviate the severity or turn it off? And those are the things where the scientists want to understand the disease and then take it right back to the patient to say, okay, now that we're here, how do we intervene in a way that adds to the fullness of life?
Yeah. It's well said. And as you and I were talking before, we talked a little bit about the longitudinal nature of research, that it takes time. You have this lengthy view of results. And I think particularly in our culture now, and I know I'm a part of this, there's a desire for immediacy, right? I want a return, and I want that return very quickly. I don't even want to have to drive and rent my movie anymore, right? I want it to just be available immediately. And for those of us who can remember even driving and renting movies. So when I hear you talk about that, I think this is the person we need in the seat doing this long-term longitudinal research. And what kind of results are happening? Is there something that I can benefit from that TGen has done so far? And maybe it's not that I'm going to be healed or I'm preventing a specific disease. Maybe there's some other way that I'm benefiting from what TGen is doing, just in the shorter term, because that's the way we think.
It is the way we think. My area of research is in the space of cancer, and my own lab research is in a disease called brain tumors, or glioblastoma is the most common malignant brain tumor. That's the tumor that claimed Ted Kennedy. It claimed Senator John McCain's life. President-elect Biden, his son, Beau, his life was cut short by this same tumor, a glioblastoma. It tends to be a pretty aggressive tumor. You'll note that I mentioned males. Men get glioblastomas almost twice as often as females for reasons we just don't understand. In fact, for many cancers, there's a prevalence of males over females. It's risky to be a male, I guess, is one of the.
I didn't know that. I mean, I knew it was risky to be a male. I didn't know in the area of cancer, it was also risky. That's why.
Right. And so helping us understand these prevalence of diseases and how do we do early detection? Small problems are easier to fix than big problems. So that's a typical theme that runs through. So tracking the longitudinal development of disease, where we could follow individuals with a disease, and then that allows us to look back in time. If we have blood samples from those patients, we can see, could we have seen this earlier? And that's everyone's desire, is early detection so that we can make a difference. Or maybe not just early detection, but how would you delay the onset by a decade? Those would be huge scenarios. I'll just use a couple of examples to highlight how this impacts us. One would be in the space of a terrible disease called pancreatic cancer. 20 years ago, when we started TGen, the number of 5-year survivors with pancreatic cancer was very, very close to zero. Very, very close. It was a very terrible diagnosis to hear for a loved one. Fast forward in the last 2 decades, we've started to build 5-year survival base where we've come up with different kinds of treatments, combination of therapies, ways to see when the therapy we're trying is no longer working, stop using that and switch to something else. These kinds of interventions are highly innovative from the standpoint of, well, we really need to give the medicine a chance to work. Well, the early signal that the treatment isn't working is really helpful in treatment planning for aggressive disease. And so we've been pioneering, and I'll get real personal now with everybody in the Phoenix area. TGen's been very aggressive to develop a technology that we've called liquid biopsy, and it's now becoming in the commonplace where insurance companies will reimburse for that. It's no longer a research tool that lets us decide that, oh my goodness, we're able to manage a disease. Let's take breast cancer, for instance, where women hear that and there are really good outcomes for women with breast cancer. And now this is really interesting where the field has changed. It says, are we over-treating these women? Because we're seeing such good responses and being on therapy is not pleasant. And are we over-treating these women? Well, what do you need to know if you've not given enough treatment or if you've given, right? We never had this medical problem before, but now we've managed the disease. And so a liquid biopsy helps us track what we call tumor burden. How much tumor is in the patient? And we can measure that dropping to below detectable limits. And the more patients that we follow over time, the more confident we can be that this patient is free of disease. They no longer need therapy. Turn it off. They don't need these long-term. It's incredibly exciting. And that is developed here at TGen in Phoenix, where we can say, we can see the absence of disease in a patient because of the sensitivity and sophistication of the technology. Wow. So we're now giving these ladies a clean bill of health and say, I probably need to be followed every 3 years or not so often, so that we don't take such an intrusive role in keeping people reminded, oh, you're a cancer patient. It's like, not anymore. How wonderful is that? So these kinds of advances have come from the technology and the science that undergirds us understanding markers of disease and how to see it.
Those are fantastic examples, Mike. And if you'll excuse my the way my brain works here, what comes to mind is that you, maybe not you specifically, but TGen, a little bit like the Wizard of Oz, in this sense. You guys are behind this curtain that we don't know even exists as an individual who needs healthcare. Your machines actually work, as opposed to some of the actual Wizard of Oz machines. And you're delivering these results, I would say, downstream. So you're working on them 15, 20 years before we're going to see the kinds of changes in our lives that really make a huge difference. Just to summarize all that's going on there. And I guess when I think of that, then we could just go on with that metaphor and say we live in the Emerald City here in Phoenix. It probably breaks down at some point. But what about the impact of TGen on Phoenix then, to raise it back to that level? You talked about the individual, great examples. Why, as other leaders in Phoenix or entrepreneurs, all the people tuned in that have been here or going to stay here, when they drive by TGen or they hear that it exists here in Phoenix, is that important? As opposed to being in Albuquerque?
Right. I think what I like most about TGen being in Arizona, or the Biodesign Institute being in Tempe, part of Arizona State University, or Banner's Alzheimer Institute, or Barrow Neurological Institute, right? Some spectacular biomedical, clinical, and research enterprises. What I like about having these entities in our city is that it speaks to the city accommodates us taking control of a problem that we want to be part of the solution. I think that's just spectacular. I think that there's really no boundaries around that, Presley. It can be like, well, we have too much heat in the summertime here. What can be done for CO2 abatement that creates this greenhouse effect over the city, right? Well, it's okay. If these guys are doing this stuff, can we find ways to create chlorophyll to capture sunlight, convert it into carbohydrate energy, which leaves do all the time without us telling them how to do that, right? But how do we
Mike, you're the only person I know who remembers photosynthesis from 5th grade. That's incredible that you just did that, by the way. So yes, okay, solving problems in Phoenix.
Right, and so I think having, and biomedical breakthroughs are tantalizing because it touches us, as we said earlier, it touches on the human aspiration to fulfill and flourish. So they're spectacular, but they remind us that there are other ways that aspiration to flourish show up. Solving problems in our community, a can-do mindset, making something that didn't exist yesterday and what would be a step forward. I think that's a wonderful environment to raise a family and to live in, to see like we are working on solving problems that all of us encounter, and we're not outsourcing it, right? No, we want to be part of the solution. Typically what happens when we do advances at TGen, and I can say from a 20-year record there, the local community benefits first from the discoveries that we make. And I love that. Hey, we're doing this here locally, and we hope it touches people all over the world that can benefit from it. But let's start right in our neighborhood.
And Mike, you've touched on this can-do attitude a few times. I think it throws me a little bit to talk to a researcher. You know, there's a stereotype that you're locked away in a lab somewhere, as I said, you know, Wizard of Oz behind a curtain, but you're obviously very involved in the community. I just want to acknowledge and appreciate how you're able to articulate the impact that it's having on our community. Science right now is an interesting word to me in our culture. It's being thrown around a lot. Follow the science, use the science, science-y, right? How do you look at science's role in leadership? So I'm, you know, in business, or I'm an academic, I'm in whatever role I'm in. When I try to is there ways that I can apply scientific method or your thought process to my own life to make that difference, to really have that get it done attitude that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the sort of the general sense about how science does what it does is that it discovers truth. And people have this like, oh, it's got to be true, you know. So scientific laws of gravity that doesn't get violated. And what happens is in the scientific community is that, well, not quite, right? So there are always these confounding circumstances where the laws of science actually they wiggle a little bit. And what we find is that there are truths that we discover in science, but the mistake we make is that there's only one rule and it's never violated and it has to be this way. It turns out, especially in biology, there are so many workarounds and adaptations that happen in living systems that to paint it with one brush and say it has to be this way is actually unkind to the creativity of the environment. It's like, wow, the system is amazing. I feel like I'm peering into the workshop of the creator when I study cancer because of the amazing complexity and adaptability and flexibility of living things that goes beyond rules, way beyond rules. And there's an element of wonder and humility that needs to be part of our most aggressive science. We need to be humble to say what we saw was under these circumstances, and we think it holds up really well under these circumstances. And if I were to lament where I think there's been a missed opportunity in communicating in 2020 with the COVID pandemic, has been that observations are made about a brand new virus that we just learned about almost a year ago right now. Far too black and white of a statement. So, well, in this narrow context, here's what we are learning about the disease. And as citizens, we want to have black and white answers. And the reality is those aren't going to work because we're not black and white. We're multicolored, multicultural. We're highly integrated communities, and we have priorities and passions. And so in a complex scenario like that of society, the solutions are not that rigid. And if they were that rigid, they aren't going to be well appreciated because people want to say, no, we need to have more flexibility. And so the science, follow the science is good counsel, but there's economic science, there's social science, there's biomedical science. So there's all these streams that kind of get tangled in there. And you can't pull one of them out and say it surpasses the contributions of any other. So I love the idea, and people will say like, well, why do you have to qualify every answer? Well, because there isn't one answer relative to the alleviation of a problem. We're going to reflect in 2 or 3 years from now and look back on what we understand with SARS-CoV-2 and understand how does that virus replicate in different people with different ages, different cultural, ethnic backgrounds. We're going to realize, wow, there's so much we could have learned, and we will over time, but we're still piecing that together. Half of the people with COVID have no symptoms. They don't even know they have it. Wow. And others, their life is at risk. So there's this huge range of response to that. Well, why can't scientists just tell us? Because living things are complex.
Hmm.
It's not an easy answer, Presley, but the reality is that science is doing the best it can in narrowly confined, controllable circumstances. And where it gets abused or mishandled is when it's made into too broad a blanket statement about here's how it works. Invariably, there's going to be exceptions.
Scientists aren't big fans of headlines, I would imagine.
Not at all.
Little more detail needs to be below that headline. Well, I asked a muddled question there, and you gave a very scientific and articulate answer, which I appreciate. It's very helpful to the interviewer when the guest does that. My second part of that question, then, which I'll state now, is what can I take from what you just said about science's approach to seeking truth that I can then apply in my own life? If I imagine myself as a truth seeker, which I try to be in all areas of my life, are there some things I can learn from somebody from science that I could apply in a healthy way?
I like the idea of what a great question, right? How do we personalize the discipline of scientific method
Well
to our
said.
benefit,
I could
right?
have done
How
it
do
in
we,
6 words. That would have been nice. That was well said.
how do we appropriate that so that I actually can end up more effective in what I'm trying to do and take fewer wrong turns? And that really has to do with accruing wisdom over life. I love the definition of an expert as somebody who knows what not to do so they don't get in trouble. It doesn't mean they know what to do, but they know what not to do because they've been there and they touched that and they found that that was a big detour that didn't take them anywhere worthwhile. And so the experts typically know, stay away from that because it's just not going to yield something of value. And so here's where I would hope that we do this as friends, colleagues, a community, truth seekers, is to say, sharing out loud my experience where I've discovered that when I treat people this way in these kinds of circumstances, I find it's more successful, meaning I have more durable, synergistic or interactive relationships with people when I shut up more and talk less, right? And do more listening. I have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that proportion, right? So when we share things that we discover about what makes our life effective in either communication or in building a team or in leading a team, or even more importantly, raising up leaders. How do you raise up a leader? I like leading. Well, how do you get out of the way so a leader can be raised up, right? I don't even want to think about it because I like leading. Well, at some point you're not going to lead, right? So these solutions need to be talked about. So I think sharing among ourselves is in friendships, that experience we have, and then just that kind of dialogue where somebody says, are you thinking about not being in a leadership role? Well, I am the leader. Yeah, but it's going to come to an end at some point. How do you transition? And then that raises or creates this bucket that says, I need people to speak into how do I hand off or how do I develop leader? How do I get out of the way without being irresponsible of what I need to be in charge of, but at the same time, allow people to grow without overly managing. These are complicated things, but when we share that out loud, I think the Phoenix Business Forum is going to be a wonderful opportunity where people talk about leadership development and how do you get out of the way. Mel Schultz, as you called out, is going to be here next first Wednesday of February. Mel, you wanted to step out of the way. The team of folks stepped up. What a wonderful thing. How's it going? And does he want to give you feedback? That'll be interesting. So I think the scientific method is to share out loud in the circumstance where I was operating. This is what I've learned. But we do that. First of all, we got to say, I learned something. Don't do that. Okay, if I can learn that from somebody sharing it with me, that saves me a lot of pain. So coming in humbly.
But I mostly want to hear what I already believe, Mike, to be honest. You scientists, you play the contrarian role, right? Were you a very responsible and respectful teenager?
Not at all. not at all.
Really?
I'm a late bloomer. So
Okay, fair enough. I was
there's a
thinking of
lot.
that with my 13-year-old son, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, he'd love that. He'd love for me to point out all these areas where he can not go in the wrong direction. So I'm gonna try to, maybe parenting will be the last area I try to apply science to.
No, here's a really important thing. This is going to give you hope. Teach
Okay.
your son to drive because he's highly motivated and he's never done it before and he needs your help. When is a 15-and-a-half-year-old going to ask his dad for advice? Well, do you
That's a
want
good
to get
sign.
through the intersection alive or not? And so,
Use a life
what
and death experience. I like that. That
it
really
is a
puts it
life
on
and
the
death
line.
experience. There's lots of life and death experiences, but I think building that rapport is that I am on your side. I want there to be a day where you don't need me in the car with you.
And that's part of the conversational approach that we need to be having
Yeah.
in our lives and our culture.
Yeah. And it's not to say, well, I noticed this interaction that you had with this person talking to a child, right? I'm a dad of two sons. And now I have daughters-in-law. It's like awesome. And now I have 5 grandkids. It's just like, whoa, I won the lottery. But investing in their lives, like, can I ask you a question? Is a really good question. Get permission. Like it doesn't look like that. You used to always hang around with this friend. Not so much anymore. Did something happen? Yeah. Do you want to talk about it, or do you want to set up a time where we can talk about it? Right. So creating that safety environment, coming in humbly, like I'm here to fix all your problems. No, that's why the expert says, I know some things not to do. So if something didn't go the way you wanted, I lost a best friend. Do you want to talk about that? And I want to hear how that's going. That's kind of that scientific method. What doesn't work? Let's not miss the opportunity to say what I could have done something differently and have a safe sounding board. This is so true in business. He goes, oh, I don't want anybody to think I don't know what to do. That's called the CEO. He's worried about that. But he has to make decisions and he doesn't have all the information he needs. It's really hard. You're going to make the best decision you can. You're going to take 2 steps forward. And if it doesn't feel good, you're going to make a new decision because you don't get to go backwards. None of us do. And so, but giving ourselves permission to say, let's try, let me talk to somebody before I actually take that first step, because this is what I'm thinking. That humility that says, somebody's been in this challenge before. How do I move forward? In science, and now I'm going to contradict what I just said. I've had trainees and they're saying, like, is there somebody we can call on how to figure out what the next step is? And I said, no, we're doing stuff nobody's done before. And it takes a lot of courage to be innovative. It is a risk, but the environment is pretty risk tolerant. But we should do it, not broadcast from the mountaintops, but we should do it out loud among boards of directors or among those that we value their opinion. And I'm going to take a risk here. Here's what I think I know. Here's what looks like is going to be fruitful. I'm going to take 2 steps this direction. I'm going to do that. Today's Wednesday. I'm going to make that decision to act on Monday. If anybody has a dissenting opinion, I can't begin to tell you how much I need to hear from you right away. That kind of leadership that says, I'm declaring where I'm going, but I'm wide open for people to say, okay, there might be an alternative approach. That I think is so important. And learn lessons, acknowledge the lessons that we learn.
Yeah. Well, some great lessons there. Certainly appreciate the answer on how to take some of these scientific methods and approaches and apply them in our lives. We're going to head to our last question here, Mike, for the live stream. And again, we do the live stream for about 45 minutes. And then for those of you live on Facebook, we're going to turn off that live stream. And then we have an in-person audience that's going to do a Q&A with Mike. And I didn't mention earlier, but Mike is on Zoom, as you're all aware. He's actually quarantining right now because of some exposure to COVID. We're grateful that you're feeling okay, Mike. And we do bring a guest in as well for the interviews, but this is working out great, other than I would have loved to have you here in person, Mike. So with our last kind of area of questions would be the future. Well, you're a hopeful guy. You're an optimistic guy. I think everybody can see that. What are you hopeful about when it comes to maybe science or TGen or Phoenix. I'm not going to narrow you into one of those areas, but when you think about the future to come, probably it's going to be helpful just to hear how you think about the future to come because of the way you think. But anything that springs to mind for you about the future that you want to mention?
Well, I'll answer as a citizen second, and I'll answer as a scientist first. So as a scientist, what gives me enormous hope is there's probably nobody in your attending audience on Zoom or otherwise on Facebook that isn't aware that our immune systems are pretty important for our health in 2020, right? The pandemic, a virus we never have seen before, is ripping through, creating havoc, highly infectious. Nobody's immune to it. Well, not now. A year later, at some high price, right, this virus is ripped through. So we're aware of the critical role of our immune system in human health in a way that we kind of knew, but okay, I eat yogurt with cultures. I want a healthy microbiome, but actually that's actually important, probably more so than we even realize now. But our immune systems are really important. How we care for that, do we get regular exercise, really non-medical ways to care for our immune system. Scientifically, we're figuring out ways to genetically engineer an individual patient's immune system to attack disease. That's, to me, going to be the next 5 to 10 years of medical breakthroughs with enormous promise against things that have just been so resistant to breakthroughs. So I'm really excited about that. And then answering the question about hopeful as a citizen, I love it that there are so many people wanting to try new developmental strategies, both in technology, business models. FinTech is interesting. We got to make sure we protect that with appropriate ethical practices that are transparent. If someone's unwilling to disclose the transparency on the ethics behind strategies, we as a community need to say, okay, not here. That you're going to have to do that somewhere else, but not here. And we just need to say, because we know that those things should not be violated because bad things happen. The expert says, don't wander into areas of darkness where people can't ask those questions. It's true in marriage relationships. You got to walk in the light. It's true in business partnerships. You got to walk in the light. And it's true in new developmental technologies. You got to be able to walk in the light and say, okay, someone needs to be allowed to say, what's going on there? And so those kinds of things, as a citizen in Arizona, I just think this is fantastic. We have people doing very innovative things. We need to, as a community, foster the transparency of the ethical underpinnings of what we're doing and allow those questions to come out so that there's confidence that we're fostering the right kind of stuff to our fulfillment and our flourishing.
Well said, as always. Makes me excited about the future. Sometimes you get so narrowly focused on what you're doing day in and day out, you don't see all those exciting things happening around. It makes me want to read whatever you're reading to tell me that that all those exciting things are happening. That's great. And listen, we're going to wrap up our live stream here. You're going to stay with me though, Mike. Don't go away. Those of you on the live stream, we're grateful that you joined us. As I said, you can find us at phoenixbusinessforum.com. You can find us on the social media platforms, and you can find us every Wednesday live on Facebook on the first Wednesday of the month at noon. You can grab your lunch, sit in, and we are bringing on awesome Phoenix influencers like Dr. Mike Berens, who we're so grateful to have had today. And then if you're interested in being a member of the live studio audience, reach out to us in one of those ways, and maybe you can come and sit in here and you get to meet the guest. You have to probably meet me too, which will be fine. As we wrap up the live stream, I want to invite the senior pastor from Living Streams Church to come on in here and take my seat and give a blessing. His name is David Stockton.
Just like that, here I am. Good to see you, Mike. Thank you so much for all the words and the thoughts and all the years of preparation to get you to this point. And just want to real quick say a blessing over all the viewers and everybody in the room and you as well. This big part of the forum is we want to just make sure that people are getting covered in prayer and are getting loved on by the church. So that's what we're here to do. So Father in heaven, I thank you for each person that's listening, that's participating. And Lord, I just really felt impressed to pray for their relationships today. That all of the people here, we've had a year of quarantine and isolation, and communities been a little different. Society's had more tension. But I know that we are so dependent on our relationships, whether our life is feeling good or feeling bad. I know our mental health depends so much on our relationships. And so, Lord, I pray that you would really bring some people to mind for each of the people listening that they would know to reach out to and to cultivate relationships with. I pray for all of the tension that might be there in a marriage or family or a sibling relationship. I pray that you would give them wisdom about how to bring resolution and peace in those places. But Lord, I really do pray that 2021 would be a year of really strong, healthy relationships for all the people listening. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. We'll see you next time.
All right, so we're wrapping up the live